Good afternoon. It is 4:30 on March 7th. I call this meeting of the Clear Creek Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present and that this meeting has been duly called and that its notice has been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. And seeing no community input, I will go into item 4, information and discussion of the 2022-2023 superintendent targets.
Good afternoon. We are enthusiastic about the opportunity to share with you draft targets for the next school year and to receive your feedback this afternoon. And I want to start by referencing multiple documents. So if you look at the middle of this slide, it has the cover from our strategic plan, the 2020 to 2025 strategic plan. And I love this phrase from our mission statement. So we're about empowering students to achieve, contribute, and lead with integrity. And so the components of our planning work all support empowering students to achieve, contribute, and lead with integrity, but it includes community-based accountability report, pictured there on the left side of this slide, the strategic plan, as I mentioned, and then obviously the superintendent targets that we're looking. A related key aspect is also then the school improvement plans at the campus level. And we're particularly pleased that we're bringing to the board for your consideration superintendent targets for next year at this point in time, because with passage with adoption much sooner by the board, it'll allow campus planning even before the end of this school year to plan for the next year and work towards the targets that also relate to the strategic plan and the community-based accountability report. So I've already referenced the mission of our district, particularly that key phrase of empowering students to achieve, contribute, and lead with integrity. Another aspect of the strategic plan that I'll reference are just the 5 strategies and the result statements. And as with last time, the formatting's a little different in that it's vertical rather than horizontal, but it still references strategies and result statements for each of the superintendent targets. The superintendent targets also each reference a community-based accountability pillar with which it particularly aligns, although the targets, most of them relate to multiple pillars, but here are all the targets listed, and you saw these in the presentation of the latest community-based accountability report at last week's meeting. And so just to hit 3 highlights of our approach to the targets as a refresher from our previous discussion about our approach to the targets is we're wanting to align strategic planning and expectations for the superintendent, the district, and campuses. So the superintendent targets aren't in isolation or a silo from the overall strategic plan or from school improvement work happening at the campus level. And then a second key concept is just the notion of coherence. So we seek to build shared understanding and commitment to our goals and our plans, and really a common understanding of both the purpose and nature of our work. And then the final row here, just as if our approach is a 3-legged stool, the third leg of that stool relates to iterative, responsive, growth-oriented mindset. So specifically, we don't want to adopt a plan, view it as in concrete, but we want it to be iterative, to be open to new and better options, and so it's responsive to qualitative and quantitative data, and it's all ultimately growth-oriented mindset, never having rest on your laurels sense approach, like, hey, we got this, we're making progress towards the targets, but always how can we do an even better job? And I wanted to share this graphic, which you saw last summer and last fall. We had talked about how this contrasts with the perspective that's often associated with strategic planning that's not responsive or iterative, and that's the concept, the unrealistic concept of a straight incline moving towards the goal. And the reality, obviously, is unknown challenges and unknown opportunities, and sometimes the strategies for seizing those opportunities or overcoming those challenges are unknown when you start off. And so really what you'll see from this iterative process is there's a lot of continuity from the current superintendent targets, but that the targets have evolved. Another quick reminder relates to the nature of the metrics. And last summer and fall, we talked about the importance of fidelity metrics. Yes, effectiveness and impact metrics are important, but we should not just jump straight to effectiveness and impact metrics without thinking about whether or not what's intended, what's planned, is actually happening. And then the effectiveness and impact metrics are more relevant in that context. Another way to look at it is, for each of them, is the fidelity metrics asked, did we do what we said we would? The effectiveness metrics look at changes in staff, adults, as a result of our work. And then the impact is changes in students. What are the benefits for students? So the last introductory comments I want to make are really about some highlights of the revisions. And these revisions are responsive both to our experiences this year, but you will see how they are responsive to feedback that board members, that the board has given us throughout the year. So for one observation I'll share is we are more explicit regarding our work at the secondary level, in intermediate and high schools. And so there is a new target focused on an instructional framework for secondary teaching and learning. So you'll hear about the new proposed target in that instructional framework. But also, when you see the literacy development one, you'll see the incorporation of targeted small group reading instruction for identified intermediate students. So that's an example of how these superintendent targets have been revised to be more explicit about the work at the secondary level. There's also a more explicit focus on two-way communication with a variety of stakeholders, and that is an example of something that board members have commented on during presentations, during workshops this year. And so we've wanted to be explicit about our work in that area. A third highlight is that we've reframed the superintendent target relating to professional learning communities to focus on student impact, specifically student growth. So the work, the strategy is still the same, but we wanted to step back and say, okay, why? Let's be clear up front about why the professional learning communities are important. It's about student growth. So the topic is student growth, and professional learning community is a key means to that. And so that's another revision you'll see. Finally, I'll just reference several other iterative refinements. You'll hear about our plans to accelerate personalized learning in elementary schools and other changes as well. So we have six targets. 3 of them relate to instruction, first-time instruction. And first-time instruction is just the instruction that initially occurs before any remediation or acceleration, for example. So you see 3 relate explicitly to first-time instruction. I'd like to go ahead and, I don't know if Dr. Bayard has any introductory comments on this particular slide before we move on to others, but I will give him the opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. If you're following along in the draft document, Mr. Palazzi is going to need to step out soon, so we're going to jump to page 13 in your document, and in the slide deck presentation, we're going to jump to slide 17. Before Mr. Palazzi starts, I want to just give you just a little bit of an outline of the way the targets are laid out for you. We have made the connection, explicit connection to the community-based accountability pillar. as well as the strategic plan strategy and specific result statements where applicable. You'll also notice the fidelity, effectiveness, and impact metrics where they exist vertically this year, along with the description of what those metrics entail. In the actual draft document of the targets, we felt it was important to also include background and any communication notes just for that transparency. Mr. Palazzi, you want to take us through mental health resources and supports?
Absolutely, thank you. So moving forward, one of our target areas that we've met and kind of worked through, and it was always there, was the mental health resources and supports. And this is actually an iteration from one of our older ones once we came back from into COVID and coming out of COVID. Felt it was still something that we needed to pay special attention to. And it's nice how it aligns with our community-based accountability pillar of safety and well-being, and our number one strategy of the district is we will foster a safe and nurturing environment. So ties in very well. We looked at it very specifically and intentionally of what the old target was, knowing the circumstances we were in and how we wanted to adjust that, or if we wanted to adjust it moving forward. So if you look at the fidelity statement and the description, to what extent we're going to implement these action steps, we kept the percentage the same, 90% of the students, but we adjusted it to account for PK through 12. We all are under the understanding that every student is going to need support. Coming out of COVID, a lot of the discussion was how could we assess PK through 3 students? How are we going to know? How are we going to survey them? And we kind of address it in here, but we thought it was really important to include those PK through 3 students. We know they're part of our school community, but in addition to those, their teachers, their parents, the community is part of it too, and that's one of our resources we're going to use to move forward with this target. If you look at the second bullet point, the spring 2022 end-of-year surveys submitted by students, staff, and parents will show an increase from spring 2021 of students PK through 12. The report knowing how to access mental health resources and supports. Previously, we didn't have parents on there. It was surveying students. We thought it was important. The teachers are with these students, 8 hours a day. Their parents are with them the other times of the day. So that's how we're going to address the PK through 3. That data is going to be profound in what we see. The parents reporting back to us that they know how to, they speak to their children about it. But more so, if you see when we come down to the impact statements, I'll get to that. But that's how we were going to bridge that kind of divide between PK through 3 and then the 4 through 12. If we go to the effectiveness, we also added things rather than just counselor check-ins. Previously, if you remember, we had the number of check-ins average per student with the counselor, but we were utilizing that as check-ins, as assuming our mental health is being addressed every time. Now, we did have the mental health, small check-ins, but it was just from a counselor check-in perspective. So we're going to use student support counselors, the reports for them, students, staff, mid-year survey to the parents. Can we ascertain some data that we need to adjust some practices, which previously we were doing end of year data acquisition. And to demonstrate an increase in utilization of in-district and community mental health resources. But we did not want to get rid of the student check-in. We still want to have those student check-ins with the counselors. And we're going to continue the PK through 12. So we want to make sure we're aligned with our fidelity, what we're saying we're going to do, that we are following through with that, and having data with the surveys, mid-year, end of year, and the counselor check-ins and the student support counselors. So we're broadening our scope to help the whole child. Again, the average will be 3, what we said, and some will have more, some will have less. The impact statement, I think, is really, again, I'll say really profound, because what we're saying, at the end of the year, we're going to say, PK through 12, 80% of the surveys submitted by students by staff, by parents, are going to indicate that the well-being of the student is supported by our campus and our district. So we are wanting to justify all the measures we're putting in place, getting the data from the surveys, from the parents, from the students, from the staff, that we are supporting their mental health needs. We can't guarantee changes in behaviors. All we can do is provide supports, provide information on where to get supports, but we can also get the data from the student support counselors, from their parents, from the counselors to show that we are meeting their needs. And that mid-year data will also help us. If we're not, we can adjust our practices to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzi. We'll next go back to slide 12 for budget
All right.
development, and Mr. McClarty will take you through that target area.
Before we go on, and maybe I just missed it on the way in, are we going to ask questions at the very end? Okay.
That was our plan, if that works for the board.
All right, page 12 of the PowerPoint and page 4 of the extra support information. Community-based accounting pillar for budget development is fiscal and operational systems, and our strategic plan strategy is we will expand the organization's capacity to accomplish our strategic intent. We had a much similar target the current year that we're still working on. So the Budget and Planning Committee is working every other week. We're meeting and trying to develop a long-range blueprint for the board to look at. Some of the actions will be taken immediately next year. Some we've already started working on internally. And then some of them will be longer term. There'll be ideas on this is where the board may want to go down the road if we continue to have financial issues, if the state does not help us with our funding situation. So that's what you're going to end up seeing in the end of May timeframe. But just to give you an idea that this is kind of talking about that whole process and implementing the first year. So under the fidelity metrics, the first bullet point is implement and communicate year one of our multi-year financial plan that has options for expenditure reductions and revenue enhancements. Implement the first phase of that, not the entire plan, because some of it is longer term. And then communicate, we felt like it's really important to start getting out in front of this and communicating the situation we're in, why we're in that situation, what we plan to do to our, not only our internal audience, which would be teachers and principals and everybody else, but also our external audience. And I met with Elena earlier today, and we started kind of brainstorming ways that we could do that in the most effective way. And then develop and implement a legislative action plan to solicit legislative relief for budget challenges. Already started working towards that. The formula transition grant is one of the things that we're going to work towards educating our legislators on. I've already sent out emails to every district in Region 4 that is receiving formula transition grant. It was a huge groundswell of support saying, hey, we're with you. We need the help as well. So we're working on getting that coalition together of districts that are facing the same situation so that we can address that with our legislators. And then this is a new one, to create a stakeholder advisory committee comprised of staff, parents, and community members to provide feedback on expenditure reductions and revenue enhancements. Back in I think it was 2011, when we had our last big financial crunch due to the state cutting, I think it was $5.4 billion out of school funding, we brought in a community group of people and we walked through options. We said, okay, if A happens, then here's some options we could take as a district to either raise revenues or decrease expenditures. And we did that over probably several months time frame. Not every week, but every other week, maybe we'd bring them all together and talk through different issues. And we're thinking about doing the same thing next winter and spring, during the legislative session, so that we're ready. The legislature decides not to do anything to support schools, whether it's a formula transition grant or additional funding. We've already got that committee together, have been talking through different scenarios, and the idea would be for that committee to come forward and make some recommendations for the board for ways to handle this in the future. So that would be the fidelity. The effectiveness metric, we make financial decisions that align with our long-term planning and our district does not use more than 20% of capital or contingency funds in any given fiscal year. That's the same effectiveness metric that we've used this year. We're at preview, enrollment didn't come in like we expected it to. We had hoped and planned for a pre-COVID enrollment gain to gain those back. That has not happened, as you know. The other, I guess, compounding impact is that ADA is way low. Our kids that are enrolled are not coming with the frequency they did last year or previous years. And we're used to about a 95 to 96% ADA rate. We're around 92 for the year so far. We got 4 or 6 weeks that we've already measured. So that's going to compound to create a negative pressure on our revenues this year and our expenditures. So, but we think that coming out of this budget year, next year, we're going to budget with no growth at all in enrollment. That's our plan. But we're going to suggest that ADA will go back up because we won't have the COVID lingering as much. We're hopeful, yes. So just by doing those two things, even if we don't increase enrollment, 1% increase in ADA is $3.3 million to our revenue. So if we can get that from 92 back up to 96, that's 4 percentage rate increase. That could be $12 to $15 million additional revenue, even if we don't do anything else.
You said 3.3 million?
Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're thinking, kind of a preview of what we'll be talking about with you in the future as far as the budget goes. But we do believe that while we may not hit the 20% target in capital and contingency this year, we believe that going out in out years, we should be able to do that. So that's why we've kept that at 20%. And as we go through the budget process, the next weeks and months, we'll have a better idea of that. And then the impact metric, the multi-year financial plan effectively informs financial decisions in support of our strategic plan as indicated by the perception of trustees, staff members, and community members. That's going to be a part of our education process, our communications process, to make sure that everybody within and outside of the district understand where we are and why we're there and how these multi-year plans are going to impact us in the long run. And that's all.
Ms. Lafari. Next we have first time instruction, student academic growth.
It's me.
Dr. Sobel.
So this target is actually an iteration of the current year's target. Focuses around engaging well-rounded students. That's our community-based accountability pillar. And then our specific results statement in our strategic plan is expanded learning opportunities to foster growth for each learner. So this year, we really worked to create PLCs, professional learning communities, and work with the schools to put some structures in place to be able to help them be successful. And so we did some intentional work with our Leaders Learn, our principal groups, as well as our assistant principals and our deans and our instructional coaches to help facilitate those processes. And so for next school year, our fidelity metric will be that 90% of STAR or EOC teachers will report participating in a PLC, a professional learning community, where they collaborate together and they identify and clarify the essential standards, as well as identify success criteria for those standards and develop checks for understanding. So those are those common assessments that the teachers work to develop together so they know, using the success criteria, what they're looking for at the end of each of the units or at the end of the instructional time period. For effectiveness, we're looking at the majority of these teachers will report being able to identify and clarify essential standards together, as well as report designing learning experiences and assessments, prioritizing the essential standards. So you may remember a few months ago you heard those teachers from Clear Springs come and speak about the work that they're doing, and they're really leading our pack, and our goal is to consistently do that across the district for the groups of teachers. And so in June of 2023, the district staff will present some academic growth information and achievement to the board. as well as present in the annual community-based accountability report, lots of other details. A particular interesting note this year is that our 2023, so not this school year, but next school year, accountability, a STAR and EOC accountability manual, won't be out until next spring. We know, and you may have heard, that there's a redesign occurring at TEA for the STAR and EOCs, and we have some information about what that format, how that will look different than current year and previous years, but we don't, of course, have all those details yet. We're also not sure about the growth measure and growth measure comparison for future years with current year performance. So although our fidelity and our effectiveness metric focus on the STAR and EOC, all of our core classroom teachers are expected to be participating in PLC. We have some courses there that a teacher is considered a singleton, which means they're the only one on their campus. And so we have some district level PLCs where teachers from across the district get to meet and collaborate together. Those don't happen quite as often as the ones where you may have an algebra team where there's a group of teachers that meet every week, but we are expecting all teachers to collaborate with colleagues. We know this collaboration and working together essentially builds teacher efficacy and helps teachers be better together in an effort to better meet student needs.
Thank you, Dr. Silva. Our next target area is first-time instruction, personalized learning, and Ms. Hughes will take us through this target.
Absolutely. And this is the accountability pillar for engaged and well-rounded students. And moving into the strategic plan strategy and specific result statements, we will design and implement learning experiences that inspire student achievement, agency, and growth. There's 3 result statements that are underneath this. Expanded learning opportunities to foster growth for each learner, which is so appropriate for this, as well as consistent student goal setting systems to increase reflection and ownership of learning, and learning opportunities to ensure each student achieves high levels of learning. Dr. Williams launched this with saying that on this target that we were going to accelerate across multiple elementary campuses, and that is exactly where I see the fidelity metric leaning in, and that is that we are ready to, and proposing that we move forward with providing that high quality professional learning for all of our elementary schools. This year we've had 10 that have gone through this commitment and time and learning together, and it has been exciting, and you witnessed some of that excitement with Ross Elementary. If you remember Ross and the Roadrunners that came and spoke to you, that might jog your memory on this one. That is an example of a Wave 1 school that has gone through this process. Next year, we're looking at, or in the future, we're proposing with a target to increase to this Wave 2 of the 17 of the rest of our elementary campuses, including our 3 schools that integrate the robotics, coding, and computational thinking. It has been, this target is definitely an iteration of our previous target and our previous work, and this is expanding that, and this fidelity metric certainly ties into that. And with Dr. Silva's comment there about the PLCs, one of the first questions in PLCs is, what do we want all students to learn and know and be able to do? And this ties really well, and the campus is one of the pieces that they see so that's so exciting about this, and seeing the impact is the compounding of those two coming together, of the PLC work and this personalized learning. So as we move forward to effectiveness, we are currently collecting classroom walkthrough data and perceptual survey data, and we will move forward with that for both Wave 1 and Wave 2 schools. But they will be increasingly using personalized learning strategies to engage students as reflected by growth and baseline surveys and walkthroughs, and subsequent surveys and walkthroughs. We're looking for the different aspects of personalized learning. We're looking at flexible path and pace, collaboration and creativity, reflection and goal setting, and targeted instruction. All of our elementary schools in Wave 1 are zoning in on that reflection and goal setting as a high priority, and most have chosen targeted instruction as their second piece of their focused work. And then finally, an impact. We have for 90% of students and 75% of the classrooms of Wave 1 schools observed during these learning walks can articulate those goals, reflect on work, and are making progress towards those goals. One of the biggest impacts that we've been working on this personalized path for a while. This year we're seeing the compounding efforts of the goal setting and this piece of reflection. It's been a powerful piece of keeping high aspirations for all and moving us through the pace of certainly accelerating the learning for all. And so that is our component for personalized learning.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes. As Dr. Williams mentioned, we have an additional target for first-time instruction, and this is instructional best practices. Mr. Moses will introduce this target for us.
Thank you, Dr. Bayard. As was mentioned, this is a brand-new target to kind of address the need at the secondary level of instruction focused strategies. So the target area is instructional best practices. Community-based accountability pillar there is engaged, well-rounded students. With a strategic plan, strategy 2, we will design and implement learning experiences that inspire student achievement, agency, and growth, with a results statement of expanding learning opportunities to foster growth for each learner. So although it is a brand new practice, we will look at some previous frameworks in order to build upon that, as well as working with some of the strategies that we currently use with our secondary teachers. Of course, the first question in the PLC has already been mentioned. What is it that we want students to know or be able to do? And of course, that's very important. The ability to clarify and identify essential standards is very important. However, how that teacher designs that lesson to make sure that happens is just as important. And so that's what we're going to be looking at with this framework, a collaboration piece, if you will, amongst teachers, working together in their PLCs, of course, learning from each other, and also developing a level of consistency in our instructional practices from campus to campus, as well as from content area to content area. So if you look at the fidelity metrics, district and various campus staff will collaboratively develop a framework relating to teaching and learning at the secondary level and begin professional learning related to that framework. So we'll go back, and if you go back in time to 2009, you'll see a collaborative learning, a common learning framework that was developed here in the district, and we'll be taking pieces of that framework and building upon them to reflect our latest research, as well as best practices and tools in order to give our teachers a toolbox to use while they are developing these engaging lessons for first-time instruction. From there, the effectiveness metrics show that teachers participate in professional learning to develop a deep understanding and ability to implement new learning, and they'll increasingly use key strategies as measured by growth from baseline surveys and walkthroughs. Again, moving not just with the teaching, but also to the ensuring of learning that's taking place in the classroom with our students. Some of those frameworks have obviously multiple components: questioning, targeted instruction, response to intervention, reflection, goal setting, dialogue, Socratic circles, things of that nature, in which the teachers can reach into their toolbox, utilize those, again, to have engaging first-time instruction and ensure that the learning is taking place in that classroom with some consistency from campus to campus. The impact metric shows 70% of secondary students report engagement in core classroom learning experiences identified in targeted components of the framework. Can they identify students, what they're learning, and the method in which they've learned? If we can do that, then we know that we have narrowed those instructional best practices down to where they can identify them themselves. And of course, the two-way communication involving teachers as well as administration to, again, promote the emerging shared vision of that framework will help ensure that learning takes place in the classroom.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. The next target area is an iteration of the 21-22 school year. I'll take this one, literacy development. The alignment to the community-based accountability pillar is the professional learning and quality staff. Strategy is strategy 2. We'll design and implement learning experiences that inspire student achievement, agency, and growth, with the specific result statement, learning opportunities to ensure each student achieves high levels of learning. In the 21-22 school year, the majority of our teachers and administrators for K-1 are completing the Reading Academies training. So the iteration is to evolve this into grades 2 and 3. For our fidelity metrics, 95% of teachers in grades 2, 3 have participated in and completed Reading Academies. This is where we have explicitly expanded the work into secondary, into this next fidelity metric. Every intermediate school will develop and implement targeted small group instruction for identified students. As we move into the effectiveness metrics, 90% of classroom walkthrough visits from January through March during the kindergarten through 3rd grade literacy block, so again, that expansion into 2nd and 3rd grade, will indicate instructional practices based on the science of teaching reading, and those will be shown that those are being implemented. At the intermediate level, secondary, select intermediate school staff will participate in professional learning to better meet identified student needs related to literacy development. And remember, we didn't have an impact metrics for literacy development this year for the 21-22 school year because our teachers are engaged in that work. And so, I'm sorry, we did. There's a little adjustment for this year. That growth in student reading proficiency will be demonstrated based on the percentage of students reading on grade level, as evidenced by Amplify composite scores as compared to spring 2021. Our students are engaging in that work to take Amplify. Proficiency on a composite score is at or above benchmark for the end of year assessments in kindergarten and 1st grade. Our secondary campuses are embarking on the work of providing reading interventions, particularly in tiers 2 and tier 3, and so we look forward to expanding this target into intermediate school as much as we've been working on literacy development at the elementary level. And we already heard from Mr. Palazzi on mental health resource supports. That takes to campus and district-wide actions in that alignment.
And really, I'll just close with the brief statement again, emphasizing the connections between superintendent targets, community-based accountability, and strategic plan. And it's very important. The development of the strategic plan occurred before I had arrived, but that was a broad-based process that, in terms of, there were multiple days, 2 or 3 full days of a committee of stakeholders developing the core of the strategic plan, and then multiple action groups developing result statements, and those action groups included a variety of stakeholders. And the strategic plan was essentially connected with community-based accountability, again with those measures having emerged from input from the community. And so then the superintendent targets fit in that. And again, I'll just emphasize we're very appreciative of the opportunity to be able to have superintendent targets adopted prior to the end of this school year, so that will inform the school improvement work that will connect with all 3 of these concentric circles. So at this time, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, and then I know that we'll also, board trustees will have the opportunity to provide feedback in addition to questions.
Before I open it up, I just wanted to thank all of the presenters for, your time and for kind of touching on, the highlights within the targets. And with that being said, I'll open it up to my fellow board members for any questions, comments. Mr. Bowen?
Sure, and this is kind of the question I was going to ask originally, and it sort of applies across the board. We do have now a lot of targets that identify baselines based on data we already have, especially from 2021 and presumably from 2022 also by the point that these go into effect. So on any of these targets that identifies a baseline and compares our performance next year to this year or last year, when we do finalize the targets, can we go ahead and include what those numbers are and where they came from? Just so that we know from the get-go what we're being compared against.
Yes, at the end of this year, and that's what's nice about the targets being developed now. We'll be able to, at the end of the year, capture the data and include it, and so it can still continue to be an iterative process with what ultimately the board decides and approves, knowing that we have the iterative data from this current school year.
And so what we can do is take a look at what makes sense in terms of formatting a supplementary, because I'm hearing Dr. Baird reference end of the year, so there may be some information that's available now, but others that would be available later after the adoption. So if we proceed with adoption, schools will have access to the baseline data that exists, knowing that as we move forward and more baseline data for the entire year becomes available, that can be explicit as well.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is that in this document, when we do have the targets published for things that refer to like spring 2022 end of year surveys show an increase from spring 2021 surveys. Can we include the numbers from the spring 2021 surveys in this document?
So what we're saying is we'll take a look at it and bring it back. It's our hope that the board can take action soon before some of that data may be available. But what we'll take a look at is what's available now that could be integrated and what's available that could be included with an updated version of it. So when I use the word supplemental, hypothetically it's integrated, it's just a revised version, but is so that one looks at the targets, one sees the baseline data. So we'll take a look at that. I just wanted to mention that it wouldn't necessarily all be available at the time of the adoption, but we can talk about how to make sure we're clear.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Just for everything we do have, because of course we're adopting these in March and April,
Right.
And obviously spring isn't even over yet, so some of this won't be available until then. But for everything we do have, I'd like to see it included.
Sure, I'll go next. Well, thank you all very much for all your presentations, and Dustin, thanks for being here. Right. I feel like this is, for me, my first go-around, so I really don't know what to ask other than I took some notes, and I'll just mention this. I do know that Brian mentioned a phrase that says help the whole child, and it feels like this does do that. So I really appreciate that, and he said that at the beginning, and then everybody, as they made their presentations, it really felt like all of that was in there. In his section, there was a mention, or actually it's listed, and it says leadership development under, in his portion. And I don't know, should that be, it's a question, I don't know, should that be somewhere else, leadership development? Do you know where I'm talking about?
Yes, it's the second bullet in the effectiveness metrics.
Yes, yes. So, you've got the mental wellness, interpersonal skills, leadership development. I don't know how that really falls into safe and secure, other than, you've got counselors, so obviously that's, in that, mental health resource, but are we talking leadership development, like, student council and things like that?
So, our students, not only to visit with counselors, but part of their mental well-being is through programs such as Character Strong or The Leader in Me, which is a big, substantial part of it, is that leadership development.
Right.
And so, as students are visiting with adults, and in their lessons, there are opportunities to have check-ins of how are you doing, checking on their well-being.
I just think it's such an important, it's an important factor, that I don't want it to get lost, if it was me, get lost and not made the priority, or a priority is identifying them. And I know Leader in Me, teaches kids how to have organizational skills and inclusivity and, just so much developmental skills that they'll need in the real world. And one day they are our future leaders. And so making sure, I felt like it was kind of getting lost maybe with a mental health resource versus Leader in Me is not just mental health resources. I mean, it's, that's a very small component, actually, if you look at the program as a whole. So, mention those notes. Community input, and when I say community, I'm thinking parents, actually. Do we have a metric or goal when we have the community input, i.e. the parents, when you put together the groups, to try to make sure? I get a lot of feedback from parents, elementary, intermediate, and high school, whether it's band or math or, I don't know, FFA. So what kind of makeup do we have a target for that community input?
So in terms of community input and really two-way communication, we've been intentional about integrating communication into and supporting superintendent targets rather than having standalone parts. We've already worked with Elena Polson in brainstorming specific ways, because depending on the particular superintendent target, the nature of that community engagement is going to differ. And so, for example, on the committee that will be advising the multi-year financial planning, that's different than, say, awareness of mental health resources. But there would be there would be specific work to measure the effectiveness of that. It's not called out as a specific separate metric for this, because the metrics relate to the target area themselves. But if there's an area, if there are areas of particular interest in terms of what the communication work would look like or how we'd be assessing that, because it would be the intent to assess that, we can give additional follow-up information on that.
Well, your answer just shows the mindfulness. And that's a good answer, because of course, finance, doesn't necessarily just need to be the parents,
right,
but community as a whole. But yes, so I'm with you there. Okay. And my only last note, Paul, when he was talking about under fidelity, implement legislative action plan, Jeff, Trustee Larson and I got into a conversation with Dennis Paul just randomly at an event, talking about how important it is that these legislators understand this cliff that is in the near future. And while he acted a little bit shocked and quickly excused himself from the conversation, it's very important that we do make sure these legislators understand how important it is to us and our community that they make some changes for the future. So I like that as well. So other than that's it. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Cottrell. And I'll piggyback off of what you said, that hopefully at our meeting later on this month, you'll touch on the superintendent, the 2 days that we got to host, I guess, along with Friendswood, because I think that piece that you're talking about in terms of the Leader in Me not just being mental health, but how it related to academics. And I think that was pretty powerful, because you heard it from other districts, and other people, not just us, but other people were able to make that connection and kind of clued in on that. So I hope that that's presented like in an update or something like that.
And can I chime in real quick about Leader in Me? I've watched this program from the very first school and campus that it came into the district, and not once have I ever heard a student, not faculty, but student, say, this helps my social and emotional learning. This helps my mental status. It doesn't. I mean, that's not what it's being, taught. That's not what's being taught to the kids about that program. It is the organizational skills. It's beginning with the end in mind. It's all those things that it was invented for. And so even when you talk to the kids about it, yeah, they're not saying, oh, I'm so much mentally stronger because of this. No, I'm much more organized, or I'm much more inclusive, and we go and get Rebecca off the bench and let her play basketball with us. So that's why I say it's just such a small component of it. They're benefiting from it, and they don't even realize it. So, yeah.
And can I piggyback on that a little bit? Because I think this is kind of an area of weakness in a lot of our strategies and kind of our thinking around character education. Is we have a lot of great programs, I've seen Leader in Me, and I've seen students present it, and I know what it's based around, and I know that that it's a quality program, and that a lot of students get a lot out of it. But it seems like there is no clear statement anywhere of what we want students to actually graduate with in terms of character development, personal development, and kind of everything that feeds into that. We have a lot of kind of vague strategies and statements, but it's just not very well defined. We have no way of really telling which of these programs is doing the best job, or if they're even all kind of pointed in the same direction. And so that's not really a criticism of these targets or even these strategies. It's just something that maybe we need to be more intentional about going forward. I mean, like, beginning with the end in mind is maybe something we need for all of our character and leadership development programs. And it doesn't seem like we really have that right now.
But the students are getting that, and they'll tell you they're getting that without us having to, reiterate over and over. I mean, they'll tell you that from the beginning.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying these programs aren't good. It's just we haven't really defined exactly what we want students to get out of them. And so that means they could potentially be improved once we do that.
There's a Leader in Me 2.0. Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. DuPont.
I'm going to try to make sense of what I say. I've been trying to integrate everything together. One of the things I went back and did is try to look at what we've done over since 2021, 21, 22, and now looking at 2023 relative to going back to the strategic plan and figure out where we've been, what we've done, what we've addressed in terms of some of the things that are on there. Because I think going back to your picture with the 3 concentric circles, I think that's what's really important, is to figure out how we get the entire district aligned around the same thing, right? And you speaking to the strategic plan. I think, and maybe it's just a matter of going back and seeing what we've done or figuring out a way to talk about it. But one of the things that is somewhat missing for me is that connection to the specific result statements. And a few of you, I think Holly started saying it and did attach with a few of the result statements. And so some people did that. So it was very clear reaching back to the result statements. And the reason I say that is because I think we do need to keep track of how we are progressing relative to the plan that was developed by the community and a large group of people, and how do we keep moving forward, making sure that we're addressing the things that were intended to be addressed over the 5 years of the strategic plan. So I think it is important to go back. When I went back trying to do some of this, I think that there are complete strategies that we won't have addressed for 2 years, that either were not specifically in the strategic plan this year or next year, and then and that's strategy 3 and 5, and then even in strategy 4, I think we're addressing it, but we're addressing something that is not actually one of the original result statements. And so I think we just want to make sure that we are, and that's not to say that we aren't doing things in some of this, because you even made a statement about communication, and that appears in one of these strategies. So it's absolutely not to say that we aren't doing something in these, but I wonder if there's a way to maybe subtract that, or have another way of tracking some of those things, so that there's the superintendent targets, which are driving the main things that are happening, but then we know what we're also doing in the rest of the strategic plan. Because I think there are some things going on that are not necessarily falling specifically within a results, within a statement. And I do think there's value, at least I find value in hearing those things linked back, because especially Holly, when she talked about I guess it was talking about the personalized learning, and you specifically called out this result statement number 2, which is the goal setting piece of it, and that's one of the things that I was missing kind of as I went through. So until I hear, but it makes a whole lot of sense that that's tied into personalized learning. And so I think that's valuable for everyone to know the pieces, the result statements that are being hit on and that are tied in. And one of the reasons I think that's super important is that the new target for around the instructional best practices for secondary, and one of the thoughts I had around this was that we don't need to develop something new. There's a whole lot of stuff out there already, and I think we need to learn from, and I think you're also potentially impinging on teachers who are like, we know how to teach this, and so, but they can always learn too, and I know there's always things to learn. But I think we also need to think about in this category learning from what happened through COVID, what happened with online learning, the lessons that we learned. You all had a lot of great things that you said about coming back to the basics, and I mean, it's how we got to this first time instruction, and that we need to be coming back and doing it right and making sure that we're doing that instruction right. So I think we need to take into account all of those things as we think about this strategy. And then so an important piece for me that is in this strategy is somehow tying it into that goal setting. Because right now we have students coming out of elementary that have been through however many years of setting their goals, tracking their goals, and now they're going to intermediate school, and we have teachers that aren't familiar with that, or how they've done that, or what they're doing. And so if we're going to do something in secondary, I think we need to focus on how are we going to take these students that are coming up to secondary and let them keep going with all these great things that they've learned and the goal setting that they're doing, and taking control of their own learning, because that's the thing that very easily in secondary, it gets taken away from them. And with that, I will go to the other piece that I think somehow it overlaps with this and is a big piece for me in the whole mental health one, and that's that within that instructional best practices, if the students don't feel like they're in a safe environment, they're not going to learn no matter what best practices you have. And that's the reality of what's going on right now too. And so somehow that needs to be tied in, I think. And so if I flip to that last target, the way it was presented with the mental health resources, one of the things for me in this was it seemed very, and maybe it's just the measurement of it, but it seemed very focused on what's happening with counselors. And for me, that's a piece of it, and it's an easy piece to measure, but they're not the ones where the students are in their classroom every single day. And we can, I had examples that I thought of relatively quickly, just of students in classroom, like if a student is berated in a classroom by a teacher in front of peers, or if they are embarrassed, being told that they're not learning, or why do you need help, why should I be helping you in the classroom, or they're being told that next year they should only take AP classes if they're even considering going to college, because that's the only way that they'll be prepared for college, or that they won't even succeed later on in life if they're not in the top 10% of the class. And all those things have happened in a classroom, at least one classroom in this district. And so for me, that's a bigger piece of the feeling safe in a classroom and having a nurturing environment, and being supported. And I guess if we go back a year, I think it was in the 2021 year, we had a target around trauma-sensitive training, trauma-informed training. And so for me, a piece of this is figuring out, what did we get out of that? Are teachers using those approaches? And is that, are students feeling the effect of that? So I don't think we can totally give that up. And that's going back to something that is one of our actual results statements. And that, I remember a lot of talk about that as you all talked about the strategic plan and the development of it. So I think, I mean, for me, that mental health piece is just so big, and it can't just be the job of a counselor to identify something. I think even Christina Ford at our last workshop was talking about how sometimes teachers have check-in approaches with the students, and that is a part of all of the character training and the Character Strong, and that is a part of Leader in Me. And so I would argue to some extent, I know that you were saying that, you weren't saying that it didn't exist, you were just saying that isn't what, the way that students realize what they're getting, but all of those things are about making a safe environment for students in the classroom. And if they do not feel safe, they are not going to learn, and we've got to figure out how to address that. So that was the other piece, that mental health piece. I mean, I just see that going through a bunch of other things, but specifically to the secondary new target that was developed. And so those were the big things, just trying to see overall. I did have a question under the literacy development one, the fidelity metric that talked about every intermediate school will develop and implement targeted small group instruction for identified students. And my question is that what's required by House Bill 4545? Is that the targeted students that's talking about?
That could be for some students identified by 4545, but I see this as beyond that. 4545 is limited to STAR, but it's really students who are identified as needing that additional support of whether they're new to us and can't read, which fortunately it's very few students, but it might be students who need additional interventions that are, it's more than they can't read. It's they can read, but they need some targeted support in that tier 2. Maybe it's small groups, or for the most intensified needs, that tier 3 for the most individual need.
Okay, so and that too kind of gets back to me in all of this, which is, and I realize there has been a big effort to bring in that to affect all campuses or get that intermediate or the secondary piece in there. But for me, I think I still just come back to the overall purpose of the strategic plan, and every campus should be able to figure out a way that they fit into that strategic plan and into the targets, and not just maybe one target, but that they figure out, because I know in all of these there are things going on everywhere. I know there are things going on everywhere. So if we can figure out a way to track what's going on too, or figure out the impact of what's going on.
The only comment I want to make is about the instructional best practices, just because it's new. We were careful not to prescribe what that framework would be. We do have a lot to grow on. We had the Common Learning Framework back from 2009 that teachers used, and it was a very well thought out training over many years. We have had conversations about these instructional best practices and how goal setting is probably, we're primed for that at secondary. It's happening in many secondary classrooms already. But that's for this committee to develop, so that it's not top down and top heavy. There's ownership that has to be developed and empowered empowering our teachers so that they are engaging students. And the more that students are engaged in that meaningful work and in that collaboration type skills, the safer they're going to feel, because there's openness to learning and learning together with one another.
I agree, because the personalized learning, I mean, that's a piece of personalized learning too, is your environment. And perhaps even the students can have input into, what those best practices are, or the ways that they feel best supported as they're learning. So I think there's a lot that can be done within that. I just don't want to see it going forward as, okay, we have this new thing, then now we're going to get this training on this new thing in August and be expected to implement it, and it's not connected to everything that we're doing.
When we shared this with principals last week, that was actually one of our concerns, was the principals were going to see this as one more thing, and the principals are actually very excited about this particular target of how we're ready to move past COVID and find ways of engaging students into those best practices in ways that have continued to emerge and to get better from where we were in 2009. There's a lot more research than we have now than what we had then. So this allows us to use that.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. Anyone else?
Scott, did you have any for?
Yeah,
Mr. Lewis?
I'm hoping this will be brief. I guess I'm kind of frustrated that of all of these, the one we don't have any impact metric for is the student academic growth. I would think that would be the one thing we would have impact metrics for. Is that solely driven by the timing of the accountability manual?
Not just the accountability manual, it's also the change in the redesign in the assessment of how do we actually measure growth. Is it just for those reading and mathematics grade levels that have star growth measures? And not knowing, there's so many unknowns with accountability and with the assessments next year.
And we had lengthy discussions regarding this, and I mean, it would be possible to articulate a growth measure, but at the end of the day, you could not truly conclude that, say it suggests that we've met the impact metric, we can't conclude that it's really a result of the work, and conversely, if it suggests that we didn't meet it, we can't conclude that the work didn't have efficacy, and it's because of these reasons, in the sense that because of this redesign of the STAR test itself. And I will say that TEA states that it's not going to change the validity, reliability, the level of difficulty. That is their aspiration, but that's not been the lived reality in previous refinements of it. And so those are a few highlights from our conversation. We will, and Dr. Silva made reference to the fact that we will be reporting. We'll be reporting on the growth data as part of community-based accountability discussions, as part of other discussions, and share that. And we can look at our work as it relates to student academic growth in the context of that, but we felt like that it was so difficult to articulate a metric ahead of time and not knowing the effect of the redesign, for example, on the difficulty level. And to compare growth under one test versus growth from a different version of the test.
I guess the problem I'm having with that is if you don't know what you're aiming at, I'm struggling with why are you doing any of the other parts of this, you know? I mean, you're kind of like firing an arrow at something that you don't know where the target is.
So we do have the curriculum standards and the TEKS, and so we know what we want students, we know what the standards are, and so we want to have more focused conversations with teachers regarding the essential standards and collaborative sharing of ideas, such as you heard the math team talk about. And so we do know where we're aiming. We just don't, the reason that we didn't articulate the impact metric is the specific measurement of that. So if we say, because the reality is, if we were comparing next year's scores to this year's scores, it's a different test. And I would ask Dr. Baird or Dr. Silver or others if there's anything else you all would add to that.
No, I will, well, yes, I'll add just that that's true about the STAR scores, but I think a bigger piece, what are we aiming for, and what do we want to see is that engagement with our kids. Kind of goes back to what Dr. DuPont was saying, but if teachers are working together, Hattie's research shows that teacher collective efficacy, do we feel better, and are we working together to bring out the best in everyone, leads to a better result for all the teachers, for all the kids. And so will that show up on a STAR score, especially with the redesign? I'm not sure, but just the collaboration we see, and you saw just briefly with the Springs teachers, we know that the stronger teachers are helping some of the teachers who are learning, and vice versa, and so they're building on each of their strengths as a group to get better. And that's one of the things we want to see, what we're aiming for, to your question.
I guess what I'm thinking is, if we know we're teaching to the text, then is there any way we can measure progress on that? I would think there would have to be. I mean, apart from whatever we're told, the way the STAR will measure it.
It's that growth measure.
So well, first of all, I want to clarify a misconception about teaching to the test.
No, text, not test.
Okay, yeah, okay.
TEKS, he means, yeah.
The
TEKS.
TEKS.
Yes.
Sorry.
TEKS.
I knew
Whatever
we
they
were.
were.
Yeah. For the public, I want to make sure that was clear also.
Yeah.
Every year, even that the target for passing changes. We don't know what the target is for passing right now. Even for this year, we don't know, because that's not decided, that's not published until after the test. We won't have any growth measures. We didn't have growth measures this past year because there was no test to compare to from spring of 2020. And so we'll get growth measures this year for individual students, where there is a same test in that content area. So we'll have 4th grade math and 4th grade reading, academic growth measures for individual students. I don't know what's going to happen in spring of 2023. The tests are going to look a lot different. For example, the reading passages are going to be cross-curricular, and so rather than students reading a passage about some bridge in London, it's going to be based on some content area that they've had in previous years for that current school year.
That's the million-dollar question, is whether STAR really shows learning that's happening or what's happening over the course of a year.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if that's the case, why would we tie this to STAR?
Because we have to, I guess, is the
Well,
answer.
Can I kind of jump in on that? Because it seems like, we kind of run into this anytime STAR comes up, because we operate in 2 different modes and flip back and forth.
Yeah.
It seems like if there's one thing we probably all agree on in education, or at least we act like we agree on it, it's that STAR is not reliable. I mean, like last week when we were going over community-based accountability, If you took those STAR scores at face value that are showing less than 50% proficiency in reading and things like that, I mean, obviously we don't really believe that's happening. Like we don't believe that 50% of students in certain grades are not reading on grade level, because that would completely change how we operate. It would have to. And we don't believe the year-to-year trends either, and especially over the last few years, we have all kinds of reasons not to believe them because of COVID and not having it the year before and then the year before. So we're not able to draw a trend line on these that we believe, and we're not going to be able to for several years. So is there any way we are measuring whether we're actually achieving academic outcomes? Because we're not relying on STAR, and we know we're not relying on STAR. So what are we using, and can we tie these goals to that?
So we are using, it really goes back to the closest level to the student, and that's at the common assessments that the teachers are developing collaboratively in their professional learning communities. That is where they're seeing the growth of the students or the interventions needed. It goes back to that questions 3 and 4 of, what do we do when students don't know, and what do we do to extend the knowledge when students do know it? So that's happening there. We have gotten away from the benchmarks or the CBAs that are every 9 weeks because we heard from our community, we heard from teachers and students about how much it was so much testing all the time. From the district level, when we produce all those tests at the district level, it's a lot easier for us to capture data at the district and say, here's exactly how our students are performing all across, but it loses that connection in that classroom between teacher, student, and the professional learning communities where they're designing those assessments based on essential standards and the high priority learning standards. That is a challenge we have right now, and I'll challenge my team to continue to work towards how do we best capture that learning at the district level, knowing that it's most important at the campus and at that teacher level.
I mean, in reality too, it's just that STAR only tests certain subjects. And this is something that we should be concerned about in every area that a student takes a class. We don't care just that they're learning in English or growing in math. We care that they're growing in every single subject that they take, everything they do, as well as fine arts and athletics and electives. And I think that's what led us to some degree to the community-based accountability study and data, was to try to get some measure of that. But I mean, I guess the fact is there's not one number that's gonna show you that growth is happening. So we have to, but I agree that that's the big challenge, is to figure out some way to show it, because you want to be able, these great things are happening. I mean, we hear about them and we see what's happening. You can go in the classroom and see them happening, but how do you show that to parents and make sure that the community knows that growth is happening and learning is happening? And I personally, I think that should always be a challenge, is how do we do that? How do we, are there measures, what are the measures that we can show that happening?
And all three of you are correct. We've been through, your comments, we've been through them, all three.
Every year.
Every year, and even
question.
in the development of these targets, we struggled with even mentioning STAR EOC. It pains me to even mention that, but then we started thinking about, okay, well, all the singleton courses, for example, when you have one calculus teacher or one agriculture teacher, not one agriculture, floral design teacher, for example, at a campus, the intent is still that all teachers participate in some professional learning communities, even if it's cross-entity, but the degree and to the frequency at which they meet is probably less than with their group on campus that have common planning periods and intentional time set aside.
So, I mean, just to give an example, it seems like we think we've kind of figured this out on literacy. Because on literacy, we have an impact goal that is amplify composite scores from grade to grade. And so, evidently, we think that is a more reliable judge of actual literacy development than something like STAR would be. Not that we have it at those grades, but so yeah, I mean, y'all have researched this and found a way to tell whether the student body at large is developing literacy at the rate we want them to. And now we can start trending it. So how do we, so maybe the goal, and I don't know how we get this on here, but the goal needs to be to develop a reliable assessment measure that we actually control and is the same every year, that we can start using the trend development in some of these other areas.
So it is not an inexpensive proposition. I mean, to do, I mean, there are people, there are groups with, you know, many folks whose full-time and expertise is, you know, teams of folks with their sole professional expertise is on developing those valid, reliable measures. If we were going to do this, there's measures of academic progress that is available. We have done some work in this before I arrived on some discrete things, but to do it right, I mean, to do it district-wide is millions and millions of dollars, like, I don't know, $5 to $10 million to do that measurement with a huge amount of time. That's just the financial cost. It's a huge amount of time to administer, and also in terms of analyzing the data and making good use of it is also a significant commitment of the teacher time as well.
Right, and so is STAR. I mean, the cost of STAR is also astronomical to the district. So it seems like the trap is that you can't do both.
Yeah, so we should ask Texas to give us the money they were going to spend on STAR and let us spend it on.
And we have, that was a point of advocacy previously, and we did have the map for several.
Because there are districts that use MAP, but they're paying for MAP, and then they also have to do the STAR testing.
That's all.
Because the state has not agreed to allow some other testing measure to be used.
Yeah, I did have just a few questions on the mental health resources and supports. I know it's just a title on the slide, but I don't think we mean first-time instruction for mental health resources and support, so I think it may have been just a carryover. But two questions I have about kind of the content in the slide. In the past, I think we focused also on kind of the safety. It was kind of health and safety, and I think based on the direction we're going in, we're focusing more on mental health and the supports. And so I know in the last couple of years, we've talked about how we provide those supports. And so Dr. DuPont talked a little bit about, is this focused more on counselors, and is that really where we would focus our attention? Or does it also include things that we've talked about in the past around options for later school start times? Because I think we talked about that helping students, possibly mental health. I'm not sure. I'm not the person that would decide that, but whether that would be considered something that supports mental health if students had that option or if they needed it. But then we've also talked about other offerings that was part of the Healthy You kind of campaign or initiative that we had done as a district, and I think it was pointing to different resources that we had that were providing maybe mental health, but also just overall wellness resources for students. And I just didn't know if those were still things that we were leveraging or considering as part of this target, or if those are things that we are no longer focused on.
So there is a lot of important work that's happening that is either very closely connected to superintendent targets or is more indirectly connected, but still important work. And so I think you make a good connection in terms of the school start time discussions, because we're pleased that next year we'll have the flexible scheduling option for high school students, starting small with a relatively small number of courses, but expand over time, and that they can take in lieu of the first period. So that does relate to this work, though we haven't called that out. And so one of the things that we've talked about, though, is working with campus leaders and others, district level leaders, in terms of making the connections between other work that's not explicitly called out here and this work.
Okay. For instructional best practices, and I think we've already talked plenty about this, but just sharing, you know, I guess a question that I had when I looked at the impact statement about reporting engagement in core classroom learning experiences being kind of one of the measures. I think I was wondering, what would we measure as far as student achievement beyond engagement in their classroom experience? And so do we have some examples that we might call out that we would focus on? And so I don't know if we're looking at elementary school, if we think about some of the standards-based grading and the things that our students and teachers are following closely on their progression, and if there's something that we could anticipate looking at more closely when we think about this target. So it was just something that I had noted, and I still do think that we're entering a point where we'll have students that have only known standards-based grading that are going into intermediate school, and I do think we owe it to this approach to focusing on student achievement to understand, is there any impact? Do we see, any challenge with transition as students go into intermediate school? Because for many of them, it will be the first time they're seeing true letter grades beyond a check or a plus or all of the other.
Behind that is truly that student ownership, and that's a piece that.
Right.
That's not really true, is it? I mean, we give letter grades below grade 6, right?
We've had standards-based grading for some time now, and so we've talked about how that helps students
Pretty serious.
engage in their learning and in their advancement, and so we've done this for some time now. So this will be, I believe, is that right, Holly? The incoming sixth graders
They're already on
will be
seven.
the first
Seven.
Grade. We have students in
Seven.
seventh grade this year who started standards-based grading.
in first
learning
grade?
progressions back in elementary school, whenever that was.
But the full range will be coming up.
Oh, right.
Right,
The
I
whole-
think
You're right, their whole
That
life.
will not have seen actual numeric grades. I think this is the first year that will
And
happen.
we can have additional conversations outside of the workshop, but I just want to mention there is specifically feedback. There's specifically feedback given on whether or not the specific academic expectations are met. So there's feedback given relating to specific students or things.
Right.
We can have a more detailed conversation, but I wanted to be explicit about saying that.
And then a question on the personalized learning. I know we mentioned, this is one of the ones where pre-K through 3 will be included, or I may have written that incorrectly.
Pre-K through 3 was for the literacy development. The personalized learning is next year will include all elementary schools in that intentional work of personalized learning.
In all
Okay.
grade levels.
And were they included in wave 1 this
Yes.
past year? Pre-K was as well? Pre-K through?
Yes, this year, yes, it will, then they'll have a further impact even going into their second year of that.
Okay.
The limited teams, I believe we had kindergarten representation, but most teams did not have a pre-K specific teacher in there. We had kindergarten.
Okay.
But they were welcome as part of building the teams, the campus teams, definitely pulling from pre-K through 5.
Okay. And the only reason I was asking is thinking about the addition of wave 2, I was just trying to think through the wave 1 schools.
That's a great point.
If the breadth of who is included is changing, I just wondered how that would impact those that had been part of wave 1. So that was the only reason I was curious.
They are certain, they'll be continuing in that journey with intentional meetings and work next year.
Okay. And then for student academic growth, I think in the last superintendent targets, I couldn't remember if we focused on, if we stated measuring high functioning professional learning communities, and if we had adjusted how we were looking at it, if it was simply from engaging and being actively involved in professional learning communities, and if we just had not seen a way to distinguish between high functioning versus one that exists.
I think last year or this year, we used the phrase create highly functioning PLCs. And we have a lot more clarity now on the expectations of those, so it is more specific and detailed for next school year, the specific pieces.
So even though it doesn't use the word highly functioning, it's specific in terms of referencing, identifying, clarifying essential standards, identifying success criteria, and developing checks for understanding. So it's more specific about what would be expected, at least as a baseline. And some professional learning communities are doing more than that. But that's the expectation across, in terms of fidelity across all of the PLCs referenced here.
Okay. And then the question I had around budget development, Mr. McClarty, on the kind of that gap, I think that you mentioned, that 4%, thinking about where we are today with kind of the average daily attendance, is that, do we know? Do we attribute that to COVID as the reason, or do we have any insight into why?
I don't know that there's total insight. I couldn't really answer that. I think that it's a large part due to some of the COVID issues, because we've seen it the first of the year when in August, September, when it kicked up. We weren't expecting it, kicked up. The numbers dropped to 91.9%. Then it started growing a little bit. We were up to 93.8 for the second 6 weeks and the third 6 weeks, but then Omicron hit. Boom, it dropped back down to 91.3% for the last 6 weeks. So I think that has a lot to do with it. You know, the messaging going on is if you're sick, stay home, that kind of thing. So I think people took that to heart. Right. and maybe stayed home more often than not. And I'm really interested to see what's going to happen now, because I think Elena and I were talking earlier today, and the number of confirmed COVID cases, I think, in Galveston County over the weekend was just a few. So I think it's dropped down so far that maybe people are feeling better about it, and I'll really be interested to see what happens the final 2-6 weeks. To see if it starts jumping back up again. I don't know if anybody else.
I spoke to a dozen superintendents last week who were here, personal conversations about ADA, and across the state, they're seeing the same. They're about 4 to 5 percentage points lower in their ADA.
Yeah, I guess it's unfortunate that if we have students and families and teachers and staff that are trying not to come, if they really are sick. I mean, we've kind of established a mindset that we would just come as long as you're not.
In the old days, right before COVID,
you just
such it up.
You just show up. But I guess it's
either go to work or go to school.
But for example, in October and November, when COVID transmission rates were extremely low, the ADA was still lower.
Oh, it was still lower.
Yeah.
So I guess that's
that's true. It was still lower. So it's hard to say.
So we'll see whether or not, as we get farther past in a chronological sense, times when there were high transmissions, whether or not there's an increase in the ADA, and that's what Mr. McClarty was saying in terms of these last 2 6-week periods.
I wonder if it is all related to COVID fatigue. As soon as, when October, November hit and families are well, I don't know if they're saying there's their opportunity to go on a vacation or I'm not sure what's going on, but statewide we're seeing that.
We still can't find substitutes, drivers, nutrition workers. I mean, the employment numbers have been hit substantially too, so.
Oh, that's true.
I think people are just scared.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Davis?
I'm going to reserve my comments for another venue. Thank you.
Okay, all right. And I will conclude this, not really so much questions as really just comments, and I'll keep them real brief. When Brian was talking about the mental health aspect, I think making sure everyone knows how to access parents, students, staff, you know, if they need help, they have the resources or they know about how to go get them. Budget development, once again, that equating that 1% in ADA in the equivalent of $3.3 million, I think that's huge. And, you know, as we get the ear of some of our local, you know, and state reps, just reiterating that point to them, so, you know, they can equate that in real time. Dr. Silva, the professional learning communities, I can appreciate those because I think it's a situation where we know what the best practices are, and now we're doing something that Mr. Moses brought up, and that's consistency, right? Consistency across the district. I think those are some of the things that I know Dr. DuPont has championed when I came onto the board, is, you know, making sure that the best practices and instruction that's happening on one campus is getting doled out to other campuses. So I can appreciate the personal learning communities. When we look at personalized learning, Ms. Hughes, you and Mr. Larson and myself got a chance to see that firsthand when we looked at League City Elementary. And those kids, whether it was a first grade classroom, a third grade classroom, or a fifth grade classroom, they could tell you what they were doing, the objective. So that's where you got to see personalized learning. But once again, it's that consistency, making sure that that is happening across the district. So even if I'm walking into an elementary that doesn't have RCC right now, the kids can still tell me what they're doing. And that probably goes back to, as Mr. Bowen found out, you know, standards-based grading, right? Taking control of your learning, and we had heard about this from some students before, when I believe Dr. Williams did some of his walkthroughs, and he actually asked the students what they were doing and what they were working on, and the students were able to articulate. But once again, it's that consistency across the district, making sure that everybody knows that. When we looked at best practices, Mr. Moses, like I said, you hit on it when you said consistency. I kind of bolded that and circled it and everything because that's what we've been, I think that's what we've been concerned about, and just want to make sure that that's happening, you know, throughout our district. Also, I don't know if this was the first time, but it was good to hear you speak and contribute. So, welcome. I guess you got a chance to break the ice. But welcome. I recognize that, and it was good to hear from you. And then Dr. Bayard, when you talked about literacy development, you know, once again, it's having access to the data. But how do we use that data, and is that data going to be useful? So we all know the changes in STAR, right? But are we going to be able to compare it from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? How comparable is that, you know, information to us? But I guess after hearing all the presentations and everything, one of the questions I wrote down, and it's probably not really tied in, well, I guess it is tied in. I said, how do all campuses factor into the strategic plan and superintendent targets? So making sure that because I think if all the campuses do the things that are within the strategic plan and that are within the superintendent targets, we're on the right path. But it's just making sure that all campuses have that buy-in and all campuses know what they are and you know, that's being driven. So that's all the comments I really had. They weren't necessarily questions, they were just more observations. But once again, I wanted to thank all of our presenters this afternoon. You guys did a fantastic job. And if my fellow trustees, if we don't have anything else, I will adjourn us at 6:10.